Hi there, do you want to give Viking Knit a try but don't want to invest in the official tool yet? Or do you want to make a larger or smaller Viking Knit than your tool will allow? Then let's Viking Knit with a dowel or other tool of your choice. In addition to the dowel or other mandrel, which I'll talk a bit more about in a second, to make the Viking weave we need scrap wire and your weaving wire, and I'm using 0.4mm or 26 gauge copper, an awl, chain or flat nose pliers, wire cutters and a draw plate, which I'll talk a bit more about later. We do need a mandrel of some sort to weave the Viking knit onto. These can be round or, as you can see from the proper tool, hexagonal, or even octagonal. And I think this does help a bit when threading the wire through. So pens or pencils will be ideal. Or dowels, or any mandrels you have. Just a word of warning, don't use a pencil with an eraser on the end, as one of my viewers struggled to get the finished knit off over those ridges. The size of the mandrel will influence how many loops you can make in a round, and therefore how thick your finished weave might be. Remember, the finished diameter of your Viking knit is limited by the draw plate hole diameter, your wire gauge, and the number of loops in a round. I'm going to try weaving 8 loops, so I'm using this bit of dowel, which is 12mm diameter, about ½ an inch. The Lazy Daisy tool has this little daisy at the end for starting your weave on. Obviously my mandrel doesn't have this, so we need to do something else. And for this I'm going to use a bit of scrap wire, and I'm just using a piece of antique bronze colour-coded wire here. When I first showed this, I basically mimicked the daisy on the top of the tool, but I got a helpful suggestion to make the loops longer, so that's what I'm going to do. So I'm just going to use a bit of card and wind my wire around it 8 times. The exact length of the card doesn't matter. Then I can trim that wire off and take it off of the card. Then twist it just down from one end to hold all of those loops together. And you can use those wire ends to secure it a bit more if you want. Now I should be able to carefully separate each of those loops. We can splay them out to create the daisy. And then just curve them back upwards a bit. Then we can place this on the top of the dowel and mould those loops around the dowel. We want to get them so they're positioned fairly evenly around the dowel. And then we can fix them in place with a bit of masking tape or painter's tape. I want to make sure they're all fairly evenly spaced out and level. And these loops are going to take the place of the holes of the daisy on the official tool. If these loops aren't quite even, we can correct that whilst we're weaving, but it makes it a bit easier if they're even to start with. And I'm just going to add a bit more masking tape to hold them in position. And now we're ready to start weaving the Viking knit. If you're new to Viking knit, I'd recommend 0.4mm diameter or 26 gauge wire as a good starting point. I quite like using finer wire, but it does have a bit more tendency to kink. Viking Knit does take quite a bit of wire, and we will be adding in several times, but I like to start with the longest length that I can reach the end of. With my arms outstretched, this is about 1.5 metres or 60 inches. So to begin the weave, we're going to thread the end of that wire through one of the loops. Then we'll bend it down into a curve, and then thread it down through the next loop so it crosses over that wire that we've already got in place. You can see that a bit easier once we've pulled that wire through. We want to position it so we've got a little loop where the wire is going through that daisy that we've made. We can then curve the wire round and thread it through the next loop in the daisy. Then cross it over itself and thread it through the next loop. And we're just going to do this all the way round, so we've taken our wire through each of the loops in the daisy. Then once we get back to where we started, we want to take the wire behind those wires that we've already got in. And we can actually take the weaving wire behind those loops of the daisy. Make sure that weaving wire is crossing over itself. And then go over to the next daisy loop. If these are quite tight to the dowel, we can use the awl to help lift them up. And we're just going to continue weaving in this way. Once we get round to where we started again, we need to start our third row. And for this, we want to go between those two previous wires. So we're basically taking our weaving end under the cross that we made on the previous row. And again, we can use the awl to lift up those wires and create a path if we need to. And now we just need to continue weaving in this way, always taking the wire under the previous cross that we've made and just weaving the length of Viking knit that we want. I try to keep my weaving fairly loose so it can still move on the mandrel and will be fairly easy to remove at the end. And I do try to keep the loops fairly neat and even, but it is surprising how much mess gets tidied up once it's drawn through the draw plate at the end. Now, one thing I've noticed as I get into my rhythm is the way that I pull the wire through leaves that row lifted a little way from the dowel. This helps to provide the space to weave that wire through, and it also helps to keep the knit fairly loose on the mandrel. Now I've just about finished that piece of wire, so I'll just take it through that last loop and we'll be ready to add in another bit of wire. I'll move that old wire end straight down the dowel, and then with our fresh piece of wire I'm going to thread the end through the last loop that we made and down so it's sitting alongside that previous wire's end. Then we can take that wire across to continue the knit as before. Once we get back to where we added in the wire, we can lift up those wire ends and take our weaving wire under all of that. This will continue the Viking knit in the same way as before, but also encapsulate those ends in the weave. And then of course we can continue. And when we get around to that point again, we can lift those wires up again and take the weaving wire underneath them. And I tend to do this for 5 or 6 rounds of the weave, so those ends won't pull out or poke out of the finished weave once it's drawn. And once I've woven over about 5 or 6 rows, I'll trim off the rest of those ends and continue the Viking knit. Now, one of the questions I get asked a lot is how long to weave. I think it's one of life's mysteries as to how long the raw weave should be to get a certain finished length when it's drawn. There are some guides on the internet, but it does depend on the number of loops, the size of the wire, and the draw plate diameter that you get through. I just tend to weave more than I need, usually about 3/4 of the finished length that I want. And I can use any leftovers for earrings, like those in the video I'll link in a card above and in the description below. I tend to work on the theory that it's better to just have too much Viking weave than too little. So I've woven 4 lengths of my wire, so that's about 6 meters in total. And on this mandrel with 8 loops, that's given me about 4 inches of weave, which is around 10 centimeters. I want to make a bracelet out of this, so that should be plenty. So now I can remove the masking tape and then to take the Viking knit off the mandrel, I like to hold it at the end you've been working from and then rotate the dowel whilst I'm pulling it out. I think this just helps not to stretch the Viking weave at this point. Now, if I was using the Lazy Daisy, I'd have to cut the weave off of that. But with my homemade daisy, I can leave the weave on my scrap wire and use that for drawing with. So I'll just press those wires together a bit. Then the other tool you need is a draw plate with holes from the size you've just woven, gradually reducing down. I have the official draw plate here, but you could drill holes in a piece of wood, as I've done with smaller holes for getting fine Viking knit. I've also seen people using knitting needle gauges for this too. So I'll start with the largest hole here. My knit will go through that really easily. Then take it to the next size down. And I like to draw the Viking knit through each hole twice. I do tend to use each of the holes reducing down, as it makes it easier to reduce that diameter down gradually. And as you can see, as the diameter reduces, you're increasing the length. It also starts getting tougher to draw that Viking knit through as you reduce that diameter and you get towards its limit. And you can leave the Viking knit fairly broad, but I'd recommend drawing it through a few diameters, as this helps settle the wire and neaten up the weave. You'll also find it gets more solid as you reduce that diameter. I think I'm quite happy with this, my finished length. It's still fairly flexible and it's long enough to turn into a bracelet. So now I can just trim off that daisy, cut through each of those loops. And my Viking knit's ready. And as you can see, I've ended up with nearly 9 inches or 22 centimetres of Viking knit. More than enough to create a bracelet. Well, I hope that's got you started with Viking knitting. And if you want to see more techniques and tutorials on Viking knit and other wire work, hit that subscribe button. Thanks for watching and I'll see you soon.